Hi everyone. For today's discussion, we're going to continue going over examples that are important for your assignment 2. So make sure that you watch the previous discussion and this one before completing your assignment, so that way you can practice how to complete assignment 2. First, we're going to review setting, antecedent, behavior, and consequence sequence. Next, we'll review prevent, replace, and respond. And then finally, we'll do the assignment 2 practice, planning a behavior intervention, and the handout will be posted online. So first, let's review each parts of this sequence. So first is a setting event. So setting events affect the likelihood of the behavior occurring. An antecedent is what happens before the behavior. And behavior is the target behavior that we want to address, and consequence is what happens after the behavior. And so for your assignment, you'll be given different vignettes with different behaviors that students need to be addressed. And you're going to address these problem behaviors using the strategy of prevent, replace, and respond. So as a review, prevent is when we want to prevent problem behavior from needing to occur in the first place. So things to think about when coming up with interventions for preventing behavior is, can you remove or modify the event that precedes the student engaging in the problem behavior? And how can we avoid the problem context? Next, we want to think about replace. So teach an alternative behavior to replace the problem behavior. So in order to replace, we need to think about what behaviors can we teach that serve the same function as the problem behavior, but are more appropriate. How do we teach these? And also something to keep in mind is with replacement behaviors, ideally they are easier to do than the problem behavior, because if the more appropriate behavior is easier to do and easier to obtain the same function, it's more likely that the student will do it. So last is respond. So that describes how we plan to respond to the student behavior. So for example, respond to positive behavior with reinforcement and respond to negative behavior without reinforcement. So let's go over this in more detail. So for prevent, things to think about is eliminating the setting event. So for example, if a setting event is that the student tends to demonstrate these behaviors when they don't have breakfast, a strategy would then be to provide a snack before school. Another thing to consider out for preventing behaviors is to neutralize the effects of the setting event. So for example, perhaps we know that every time a student visits with their dad over the weekend, they tend to come back and demonstrate more problem behaviors. So a strategy we can use is to make sure that we're checking in with the student if we are made aware that they are going to be visiting their dad over the weekend. And then that way, by doing a morning check-in, the student can then feel free to communicate with you how they're feeling and what they need in order to be successful for that day. Another consideration for preventing problem behaviors is to restructure the environment to prevent problem behavior from occurring. So for example, if a student has a lot of difficulty with transitions between classes, one strategy is to provide them with a timer 5 minutes before transition. That way they are prepared and more likely to successfully transition. Another example is maybe there's a non-preferred activity. So for example, if a student really doesn't enjoy doing their math tasks, then you can do a strategy where you provide choice. So you can give them the options of which homework assignment they would like to start with or which problem set they could start with. Another example is a difficult task. So if the task is difficult for the student and that's why the problem behavior is occurring, a strategy could be adjust the task difficulty or the length. You can also provide chunking, which means that you're just breaking up the task into much smaller parts that are more manageable for the student. And then finally, another example is if a teacher is not paying attention to them and then that causes problem behavior, a strategy is to create scheduled attention to make sure that the student is receiving plenty of positive attention throughout the day. Next, let's consider replace. So when you're thinking about replacement strategies, you're going to want to ask yourself these questions. So what is the strategy? And that's going to be dependent on what is going to be the replacement behavior, what is the desired behavior, when will it be implemented, and how often will it be implemented. And then a bit later in the next few slides, we'll be going over some examples of replacement strategies. So for respond, we have reinforcement. So this is what we want to do when we're responding to the alternative or desired behavior. So a very common example is a token economy. So provide a token each time the student demonstrates the appropriate behavior, and then they can turn in those tokens at a certain point in order to get a preferred reward. Another strategy that we talked about previously in class is group contingencies. And you can decide, depending on what would work best for that student, whether or not that group contingency is dependent, independent, or interdependent. And finally, you'll want to consider how often you are scheduling reinforcement. So are you going to do differential reinforcement of other behavior, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior, or differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior? And this will just be dependent on what the problem behavior is and what makes the most sense for helping the student successfully achieve that desired outcome. Next is punishment, so responding to the target behavior. So there's response cost. That's where you can take a token away each time they demonstrate a problem behavior. Typically, response cost doesn't tend to be as effective in practice. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this strategy in most cases, but it is an option for this assignment as you're practicing thinking about ways to respond to problem behavior. Another is timeout, so having the student removed from that particular setting. Again, that's not the most effective strategy and not necessarily recommended, but if the student is doing something that's very harmful to the class, then perhaps that could be considered. And then there's also planned ignoring. So just ignoring when the student does negative behaviors could sometimes be appropriate in certain situations. So now let's get into the practice vignettes. So the first vignette that's going to be on your handout is about Joe. So Joe is a third grader who has been engaging in disruptive behavior during academic instruction in reading and math. When the teacher is instructing the class, Joe will make negative verbal statements to adult or peers. For example, this sucks, you're stupid, and emit other behaviors that disrupt instruction. For example, banging objects, making faces at peers, making odd noises. When Joe does this, peers will laugh and verbally encourage him. Joe's math and reading skills are at grade level. The hypothesized function of Joe's disruptive behavior is to obtain peer attention. So let's practice going through the prevent, replace, respond strategies. So first, let's think about how can we prevent Joe's behavior. So one way we can do that is by restructuring the environment to prevent the problem behavior from occurring. In this scenario, we didn't receive any setting events. So in this case, we wouldn't be able to eliminate the setting event without knowing what it is. So we'll just focus for now on how we can restructure the environment. So first, one way we can do that is provide scheduled attention during the math and reading lesson. That way Joe is getting plenty of attention throughout the lesson. Another strategy is pair Joe with a peer that he can work on assignments with. So a peer that he has a positive relationship with, but can also stay on task with him. Another strategy is to assign Joe a classroom job or responsibility. So for example, maybe Joe can read the announcements at the beginning of the class. Maybe he can be in charge of handing out papers, or maybe he can be made a group leader. And then another is to create several opportunities for participation during class lectures. So sometimes if a lecture is just a lot of teacher direct instruction and that the teacher is just talking for a very long period of time during the lesson, that can sometimes create times when Joe may engage in negative behaviors. So incorporating plenty of opportunities where students can participate and engage with the lesson may help reduce some of his negative attention-seeking behavior. So replace. So there's several strategies you can use to replace the target behavior. One, I'll just go over a couple examples. So one could be model lead test. So this is where you first show Joe how to do a certain behavior. You then practice with Joe, and then at the end, you see if Joe can do it by himself. So this is also referred to as I do, we do, you do. So some strategies that you may want to use is to teach Joe how to initiate an appropriate interaction with peers using sentence frames or sentence starters. You can also teach Joe appropriate hand raising and waiting behaviors especially when it's during direct instruction. Another intervention that is sometimes used in schools is what's called a talk ticket. And you can see in the image below of what sometimes these talk tickets might look like. But you can give Joe a set number of talk tickets at the beginning of class that he can turn in during appropriate class times to have a conversation with his peer. He would also get a limited amount. So then once he used up those talk tickets, then he wouldn't be given that time to have the peer conversation unless it was during a assigned activity. So for respond, so again, we went over reinforcement and punishment. So here's an example of some ways we can reinforce Joe's behaviors. So one is positive praise. So provide immediate attention and positive praise each time Joe demonstrates the replacement behaviors. You can also use a token economy. So Joe will be provided a token each time he uses a replacement skill. If Joe gets up to 10 tokens, he can exchange them to have a conversation or fun activity with a preferred peer. And for this, for Joe, I'm going to choose differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. So Joe will only receive positive praise and a token when he raises his hand and participates appropriately in class. For punishment, I would use planned ignoring. So provide the least amount of attention possible when Joe is demonstrating problem behaviors. And in this moment, you could also provide positive praise to students who are participating appropriately in class. And then as soon as Joe also starts showing that appropriate behavior, you would praise him immediately. So vignette 2 is the following. On your handout, Kyle is a 10-year-old student who has been engaging in noncompliance. During math instruction, Kyle will refuse to follow directions within 10 seconds and leaves his assigned work area without permission from an adult. When Kyle refuses to follow directions or walks away from his assigned work area, he is ignored by the teacher. He is sent to timeout in the corner of the class, or he is sent to the principal's office. Kyle's skills in math are at grade level. He exceeded state standards in reading and math at the end of the last academic year. The hypothesis function of Kyle's noncompliance behavior is to escape math tests. So what I would like you to do is on your handout is to practice developing your own prevent, replace, and respond strategies for Vignette 1 and Vignette 2. Vignette 1 is Joe, and even though I went over several examples, there's still a lot of different strategies you can use to prevent or replace and respond to his behaviors. So maybe consider some additional ways that you can do that along with the examples I provided. And then for Kyle, you can come up with your own strategies, and you're welcome to come to my office hours to review it if you want me to look at your practice handout. So make sure that when you're going through the handout, you're naming a replacement and a desired behavior, and then name strategies for prevent, replace, respond, and briefly describe how this strategy will be implemented. So think about who's going to implement it, when will it be implemented, and what is the exact strategy. And that's all. Thank you for watching this week's recording.